Thank you. And now I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let's say, Director Zubin first. Which are the countries that currently provide safe haven for the drug traffickers' finances? Is there a short list of countries that are most prominent?
No, I don't think we find that there are countries that are affirmatively stepping up to operate as safe havens. Certainly, there are areas that are less well regulated, and where the banking sector, the financial industry writ large, is less aware of the types of risk factors that I was talking about earlier that have become so central to banks in Latin America. And our efforts alongside state, alongside all of our colleagues, are of course to raise the tide for all boats and to try to see the kind of careful compliance efforts by banks around the world, and to see governments also doing more across the board. When they improve their anti-money laundering practices, that helps in terms of the narcotics effort. When they improve sanctions implementation efforts, that helps. Narcotics is touching on so many different areas that our technical assistance activities, our capacity building activities that have been flagged so well by Director Krolikowski and Ambassador Johnson are helping us throughout the world.
And how connected is this to the efforts to get at bank secrecy laws used for tax evasion? Are these very similar efforts, or are they really disjoint?
I would say they're separate, and people tend to draw a distinction in foreign discussions between tax issues and counter-narcotics or other sort of mainstream criminal organization issues. And so I see them as separate, but I would certainly defer to my colleagues to comment.
I think they are separate. I'd say obviously some of the capacity building about bank regulation can have an impact on both issues, but on tax regulation we're looking more at what our own citizens are doing, and in the money laundering we're tending to focus on what others are doing, and those tend to involve as much domestic transactions as they do international transactions.
Mm-hmm. And are there additional legislative tools or international agreements that you really need to make these financial pressure on the drug cartels more effective?
The main tool we use, as I noted, is the Kingpin Act, and it's a very powerful authority that Congress gave the administration back in 1999. It allows the president to name what we refer to as Tier 1 kingpins, whether an organization or a major trafficker, and then it falls on us in the Treasury to follow up. And when I say us in the Treasury, I'm not really speaking about a single agency effort by any means, because it's the intelligence, the law enforcement information from our colleagues at this table that are the fuel for these actions. But what we ideally do is go after the companies, the front companies, shell companies, money laundering vehicles, the accountants, the lawyers that are propping up these networks and that are allowing them to launder and to conceal their funds, and ideally put them out of commission. Now, I don't want to give you the mistaken impression that every time we take a sanction action, it means the company closes down. There are times when we have to keep at it for years and employ diplomatic efforts and persuasion to try to bring foreign law enforcement to bear, whether that's in a seizure or forfeiture or pulling the company's registration altogether. But sometimes the coordination works so well that the effects really are immediate.
Mm-hmm. So you think it's a fair statement that you're limited by your manpower and foreign cooperation at this point rather than your legislative authority? There's no times that you...
I don't view the legislative authorities as holding us back in any way.
And then I guess a question just for anyone who wants to field it is there ever been any attempt at a sort of unified economic analysis to see where we should put our money to get the most bang for the buck, just to try to figure out, some sort of metrics for, how to minimize the economic damage to drugs in the United States and the indirect cost to our military, and just some sort of bottom line, and say, okay, given that, where do we put our resources? You could put them anywhere from bribing Afghan farmers to grow something else to try to better enforcement on the streets of cities in the U.S. and anywhere in between. And has there ever been any group that's just tried to look at the economics of the whole thing and identify the best return on investment?
It depends on which group I'm talking to. It's been interesting, but the two areas that actually you left out, the prevention programs are critically important. If we reduce our demand here in the United States, if these other countries, and I just came back from Russia, I have heard from every country now that I have visited of their growing addict populations. It's a significant drain on dollars. A small amount of investment in prevention. We know that treatment is about half the cost of incarceration and that treatment can in fact be effective. None of this means or diminishes that we're reducing the power of law enforcement or the importance of law enforcement, and in fact oftentimes people go into treatment with handcuffs on. So I think that might be important. When it comes to the other areas that you had talked about, it's often been said that if our goal in eradication is to reduce the amount of drugs coming into the United States, would be analogous to reducing the number of diamonds by removing the lumps of coal. There are a lot of good reasons for various eradication programs, a number of good reasons for it. But if you really look at how it's going to reduce the amount of drugs that are in the United States, that is probably at the lowest end of that tier.
All right. Well, I thank you. I guess my time's expired, and so now recognize Representative Micah.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad we are conducting this hearing. I had the privilege of chairing this subcommittee or its predecessor back 98 to 2000, and I think responsibility for oversight is extremely important. I am dismayed, however, at the systematic dismantling, and we heard we're not even supposed to talk about a war on drugs. When this administration comes in and takes your position, Mr. Kurlikowski, takes it out of the cabinet, to me lessens its importance of visibility. Some of the efforts to promote legalization may be well-intended, but they do have consequences. And some of the reduced enforcement, all of this will end up with more young people in particular who look to role models and also look to leadership, believe it or not, and the direction from the highest office of the United States towards their attitudes of drug use and drug abuse. So I think we're headed downhill. I saw some statistics the other day I thought were disturbing. With crime down generally across the country, we still have young people addicted, and was it Mr. Who gave the statistic, Placido, 31,000 deaths. It is by far the worst social and criminal problem that we have in the United States. But the other thing, too, is you have to you're talking about putting resources and what's most effective on the international scene, and that is important. I want to talk about that. But aren't most of the drugs still coming into the United States from the Caribbean and South America through the southwest border and Florida? Is that right, Mr. Kurlikowski, Mr. Placido? Is that right, Mr. Placido?
Particularly with cocaine, we estimate now that the interagency estimates about 91% of the cocaine crosses the southwest border, significant amounts of
I was
meth,
down in San
heroin.
Juan and got a briefing by the Coast Guard, and they showed me the charts of the drugs coming out of South America. They traced the planes coming out. They were solid red lines coming still out of there. So it's coming into Florida. It's coming, some of it was going up to Mexico and then transiting in. Were you consulted, Mr. Kurlikowski, or anyone else here, when the administration proposed to cut the Coast Guard positions by 1,100 to mothball 5 recently upgraded helicopters, reducing the Coast Guard's anti-drug operations in Florida, where I just happen to live, and the Caribbean, which we just cited was the main source of these people bringing this crap in, that would dramatically reduce our nation's capability. Were you consulted on these cuts?
No.
Were you consulted? Anyone on the panel? Okay. I was appalled. I'm going to the budget hearing in a few hours and speak about that. I've gone to the Coast Guard hearing, and actually both sides of the aisle were just stunned at the administration's proposal. Furthermore, in the same budget, to cut border protection, fencing, technology, and infrastructure by more than, well, it's almost a $250 million, $225 million. Were you consulted, Mr. Kurlikowski, the drug czar, on this?
I wasn't consulted on the fencing, but I do know there are significant concerns about how effective that program has been.
Well, again, our job is to take the resources and make them effective, and I'm looking for that. I'm not here just to criticize you. We want this successful. Those kids are dying in our streets. I can tell you the names of parents I've talked to in the last year that have lost their kid with drug overdoses and drug abuse. Mr. Ambassador Johnson, most of the heroin that's produced in Afghanistan, I haven't been up to the border in a long time, but it used to go to Europe, is still about 90-some% going to Europe of that heroin?
I don't think 90% goes.
Okay, well, come on, how much?
Almost none of it comes to the United
All
States.
right, that was my point. You said in your statement, I took it down, requires a global effort. Now, I don't think the United States, and I used to be involved in these panels and legislative panels, and you guys listen here, the new members here who haven't been around. We need to get some of our folks into these discussions, again, legislative people who set the policy, and get with the commissioners, get with the European Union and others, because they do have clout. And if we talk to them member to member, interparliamentary discussions, to get the EU to do more, that crap is coming into Europe, and they're suffering. And they should be, how much are they doing as far as programs in Afghanistan? What share are they doing now?
But the Europeans are contributing significantly to ISAF forces, notwithstanding the
drugs, crop substitutions, others.
Yes, particularly the European Union Commission and the British government, their international.
Yeah, well, I can tell you whatever they're doing, it's peanuts compared to what the United States is doing. They've lost personnel too, and we have lost personnel. But they have a distinct interest in stopping this heroin. And I used to go to those meetings, finally I'm over, guys, and we would sit there and the Europeans would poo-poo us about cocaine. We did such a good job up until most recently of stopping that cocaine from getting into the United States and the price down here, that it's being diverted to Europe because it gets more dollars, right? And now they're transiting, and they have a cocaine problem from South America in Europe. But we need to get more engaged as a subcommittee and committee, and you guys need to get over there. I know this is an election year. Talk to these parliamentarians who make that policy and get them engaged, not only for our benefit, but their benefit, and stop this stuff. And I thank you for letting me go over my time.
Certainly. I guess now
I have additional questions to submit.
Representative Quigley is next in subcommittee seniority.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kurlikowski, just taking this a slightly different way, we've been told by many, including the Secretary of State, that 90% of the weapons, including assault weapons that are used in these drug wars that take place, are coming from the United States. Your thoughts on re-extending the assault weapon ban as it relates to these weapons?
No, I had been on the record as a police chief for a number of years, along with many of my colleagues on the assault weapons ban. There were a number of issues surrounding that.
I'm sorry, if you could...
There were a number of issues surrounding how effective it was. I would tell you that right now that the assault weapons ban issue has not even been something that I have considered, only because of the amount of time that I've been devoting on the drug issue. But I will tell you this, that I think with the ATF's implementation of electronic tracing data that has now been put into Mexico in a Spanish version, we will know much more, with much more certainty, the number of guns being seized in Mexico and where they actually came from, whether it was Guatemala, Honduras, or whether it was the United States. And I think that information will, in fact, then impact future discussion.
It will do what?
I think that information about where the guns are coming from that are being seized in Mexico and being used to kill prosecutors and judges and others, I think that information about where those guns come from will be helpful to any administration.
Well, let's just say that it allows us to determine that 70 or 80 or 90% of the assault weapons are coming from the United States, that they're purchased through straw purchases or whatever. I mean, I know that's valuable information, but get a pretty good hunch that's the ballpark numbers now. And doesn't it make sense to go forward more strongly and reinstate the assault weapon ban? I don't know that it gives anybody comfort who's lost family members through assault weapons that we know where they came from.
I think it makes sense to take that information as an administration and to very carefully review it and consider also the problems that had existed in the past around the assault weapons ban. Other than that, there are a number of other agencies and secretaries that have a vested interest in this issue also, and I would probably defer some of those comments to them.
Well, I've asked just about everybody who's come before this committee the same question, but for the time allowed, if anyone else on the panel would like to provide their insight on that thought.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. I just add one comment, and that is this committee may be pleased to hear that through the use of the asset forfeiture fund, that is monies that have been seized from the drug traffickers themselves, we've rolled out a picket line of license plate readers in general proximity to the southwest border to inspect vehicles southbound into Mexico looking for bulk cash and firearms, and I believe that we are having some success. It's the early stages now, but in actually stopping those firearms from reaching Mexico in the first place.
Well, and I appreciate that, but you recognize you're not going to catch them all, right?
That's right.
And that having a greater source, a greater volume of weapons purchased initially legally makes it tougher to stop all of them. There's a bigger pool coming into the country of Mexico, therefore putting more innocent people, including Americans involved in this war, at risk.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now recognize Representative Lutkemeyer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wexler, I'm very familiar with the program that we have the National Guard troops over in Afghanistan trying to teach the Afghani farmers how to produce other crops so that they would no longer produce poppies, which we get heroin from. How successful do you believe that program to be?
That program, which is quite important, is integrated into a number of other programs for alternative crop development. The Secretary of Agriculture has personally gone out there and to give his advice and guidance. It is, from the Department of Defense's recent experience at least, the first time that we're integrating the Department of Agriculture into our war efforts. Mm-hmm. And it's critical that we do so. One thing that I would call your attention to is that not too long ago, in the 1970s, the area of Afghanistan that we're talking about was not a massive source of drugs. It was a massive source of regular agricultural produce that was part of the global market and made its way to market. And people had healthy, vibrant communities based on that. This is the efforts that we're doing there are not to do crop substitution and alternative development efforts are not going to succeed overnight. In fact, they're going to take quite a long time, given how much damage has been done, and they're integrated into our wider COIN efforts to do so. But it at least gives some degree of comfort to note that there was a time in too distant past where that provides a vision of where we might be going again.
Yeah, I come from Missouri, and we have our National Guard group was the first one to go over there, and we now have our group over there for the third tour. And in meeting with Colonel Lepper last week with regards to his oversight over the program, it's been, in my view, pretty successful. And I think it's probably, as you indicated, an integral part of any sort of ability of us to transform that country and cut off the flow of drug money. If they don't produce the agricultural crop from which they derive the drug, it's going to be more difficult for them the Taliban, to be able to fund themselves. So, as a result of the success of the program, are you thinking about promoting it somewhere else in the world, or is this the pilot project and the verdict still yet to be determined?
Well, we still have a lot of work to do in Afghanistan.
Right.
Again, this work is going to take place over a number of years. And it's not just, of course, going to be a military activity, but it's a wider whole of government activity to do so, because once we take the territory, we have to then hold the territory
Right.
and build the territory, and building the territory means a lot of things, and one of the things that it means is bringing this territory back into an economic zone where they can feed themselves and meet their own needs without having to rely on drug trade, and it's also important to note, for the individual farmer, there are a number of crops that provide a lot more in the way of money and value to that farmer that are completely legal than opium. We just need to build the infrastructure around and build a security structure around that that they can make the logical financial decision to move in that direction. Right now, they're not in that position, too many of them.
Yeah, I realize it's a long-term process, but I think it's a huge step in the right direction. If you can transform the economy, you can earn the trust of the people. If you earn the trust of the people, you can root out the Taliban, and I think that's where we're headed. And I think, from my discussions and my knowledge of the program, it seems to be working very, very well. Mr. Placido, with regards to threats around the world, what do you feel right now is the most the most significant threat, or what you feel is the rising threat from whatever area or whatever country that's sort of top of mind and ones we really need to focus in on?
I think it's very difficult to put them in a rank order, because we're not comparing apples to apples. My personal, and I think where this administration has been, is to really focus on Mexico, which is the arrival zone for 3 of the major 4 drugs that are abused in the United States, and because of its geographic proximity to the United States. While we're concerned about lawlessness across the globe, be it West Africa or Afghanistan, there is a certain urgency that is felt when there's instability to our immediate south. And so I think that this administration and my agency have spent a lot of time focusing on Mexico, and I think that's appropriate.
Mr. Kulikowski, what do you think about that?
When I look at the 2,000-mile border and the amount of and the level of violence, I would say that Mexico is very clearly one where we should concentrate time, effort, and resources. General McCaffrey was just recently down there, along with a number of other people. I don't think it quite gets the attention right now that other places in the world do get. But after that, I think working on the global cartel issues, because we not only see the flow coming through Mexico at times and into the United States, we see a flow coming out of South America into West Africa, Europe, the UK, et cetera. And somebody had mentioned we're all in this lifeboat together, with increasing addict populations and increasing drug problems. So when Tony talks about this shared cooperation, particularly among law enforcement agencies, regardless of nation, I think that has the most potential. But Mexico would be at the top of my list.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Lukemire.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Duncan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It was mentioned a while ago that 91% of the heroin comes up from South America, but Mr. Placido just said 3 of the 4 major drugs are primarily coming through Mexico. What do we know what percentage of the drugs, the drug activity overall is coming from Mexico?
Sir, if I misspoke, let me correct myself. The interagency assesses that 91% of the cocaine which enters the United States actually, whether it comes through the Caribbean or up the Isthmus of Central America, finds its way into Mexico to cross the southwest border. So that's cocaine.
Okay.
We also, the 4 principal illicit drugs of abuse would be marijuana, methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine. And what we know is that in addition to 91% of the cocaine transiting Mexico before it arrives, a very large percentage of the methamphetamine abused in the United States is either manufactured in or comes from Mexico. I don't know that we can put a number on it with precision. I've heard numbers, that range from the 70 to 80% range. Whether those are accurate or not, it's a significant amount. And we also get a very large percentage of the heroin, which is either manufactured in Mexico or South American heroin, principally from Colombia, that transits Mexico on its way to the United States. So Mexico has become a very critical transshipment point for many of the drugs that arrive in the United States.
Well, how are those drugs coming in? I know there's thousands of trucks that come from Mexico every day. Is most of it coming in on these trucks, or how's it coming in?
Well, I suspect that if we knew with precision the answer, we could really do something about it. What we know is that the seizures that we do effect reflect ingenuity by the traffickers. $1 million a copy self-propelled semi-submersible vessels, essentially a poor man's submarine, that are used on a one-way trip where the drugs are ballast, bring it up into the Isthmus of Central America and into Mexico, where it's staged and moves across the border. We see backpacking of marijuana and other drugs across the border between ports of entry, ingenious concealments in vehicles and on rail cars going across the border. Given the enormous profit that's at stake, the traffickers have used planes, trains, and automobiles, and I'm sure some modes of conveyance that we have not even learned of yet. But what we do know is that based on the seizures that we make, the arrests, and the information that we develop, that despite our best efforts, they are successful in smuggling large quantities of drugs into this country.
What percentage of the vehicles coming from Mexico are inspected for drugs each day?
I'm afraid I'm not the best person to address that question. That would probably be best addressed by somebody in the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection. What I can say for the record is that it's a relatively small number, and there's a constant tension between facilitating lawful commerce across the border and inspecting for contraband.
Yes, sir.
I mean, in some manner of speaking, there's 100% inspection, but the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, has to make a decision as to whether a vehicle or a trailer deserves further. They have a range of equipment to do so, but as Tony was mentioning, the ability and ingenuity of these individuals to secrete their product in places that cavities in cars that people don't know exist really requires kind of a special touch by the customs people to discern who might be a little dodgy and go after them in a very concentrated way.
All right. Well, it seems to me, a few minutes ago it was said that almost none of these drugs in Afghanistan are coming to the United States. They're going to Europe. Seems to me that we should direct almost all of this effort in Mexico and where the problem really exists, instead of to places where the problem doesn't exist. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Duncan. Ms. Chu, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I know all too well how the violence of the Mexican drug cartels can affect us here in the U.S. Last December, one of my constituents was the innocent victim of the drug cartels in Mexico. His name was Bobby Salcedo, and he was abducted and murdered along with 5 other men while visiting family members in Durango, Mexico. He was an elected official and a rising star in our community. Neither he nor the other 5 men had any connection to the cartels or the drug trade. They were just in the wrong place in the wrong time. Since Mr. Salcedo was murdered, I've been in touch with the Secretary of State, representatives from the FBI, and representatives from the Mexican government to try to understand how we can bring the killers to justice and also how we can curb the violence of the drug cartels. So I have questions on the Merida Initiative and money laundering specifically with regard to Mexico. First, on the Merida Initiative, we know that this was started in 2007, but that out of the $830 million that's been appropriated for Merida, only $26 million has been spent as of September 2009. What I'd like to ask is, the Merida Initiative, I believe, was a very important first step towards a stronger and more cooperative relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. But the official agreement ended last year, and the administration has not yet come up with a comprehensive plan to succeed this initiative. What are the plans for the future, and what would be your recommendations?
Thank you, Madam Congresswoman. A couple of preliminary comments. I think that the Merida Initiative represents a new and comprehensive method of cooperation between us and the Mexican authorities, and the type of engagement we've had with them during the course of this is in a different plane than it has been before. This is an ongoing program. What we're trying to do working with the Mexicans is trying to figure out what kind of the next steps are beyond what we've already committed to do together, what sort of Merida 2, if you will be. But our work with them under the current program continues unabated and is very, very aggressive. Second point I'd like to make is while that $26 million number that you cited from the GAO report is correct in terms of quote-unquote expended, it doesn't really reflect what's been done. For example, the appropriation for the Black Hawk helicopters that have been purchased, that will not appear as an expended fund for some time, because we don't actually pay the bills until the product is delivered, accepted, and everything's done in order to protect the taxpayer. Those aircraft have already been manufactured. They've been delivered by Sikorsky. They're in Huntsville, Alabama, being modified for the Mexicans' needs, and they'll be delivered to them, we believe, sometime in the early to mid-summer. So many of these programs continue even though they're not reflected in that number. That doesn't mean that we don't want to accelerate that just as rapidly as we possibly can. We're very grateful to Sikorsky and the Army for having found a place in the queue, if you will, to accelerate this delivery in a way that didn't affect our own Army's delivery of these helicopters, for example. We're taking as many steps like that as we can. We've delivered about 50 of these non-intrusive inspection vehicles that they require for their police and their border officials, a like number of armored vehicles. Programs we've developed to train investigators that bring in our own law enforcement authorities from DEA, from FBI, from state and local government in Houston and Chicago and Los Angeles. So there are a number of aggressive programs going on that I think reflect more clearly the effort that we have underway with Mexico.
And can you tell me what Merida 2 might look like?
I think that what the distinction will be that much of the, if you will, big ticket items have been covered under the current appropriation. Aircraft, non-intrusive inspection equipment, things of that nature that are truly quite expensive. As we look forward, we're going to want to concentrate much more on training and institution building and helping the Mexicans transform their police service and their courts and their prosecution so that they're much more effective.
In fact, I'm glad you talked about the equipment, because when I talked to Ambassador Sarukhan, he did express concern that the Mexican government has not yet received some of the equipment that was promised under the Merida Initiative. Are the items that you talked about the main items that have not been, that are really on the books but have not yet been delivered?
The items that I mentioned to you have in fact transited the border, and they're in the hands of the Mexican authorities. I appreciate that the Mexicans want to push this as hard as they can go and get materials as quickly as they can. There's been a number of deliveries already. The Bell helicopters are there as of last fall. These things are ongoing, but we're working with the Mexican authorities to move them just as quickly as we can.
My next questions have to do with the money laundering aspect. I understand that they've made progress on electronic transfers of that have to do with money laundering, but that there is a big problem with the bulk cash smuggling, and that there need to be more remedies along those lines. Could you talk about that?
The effort that we have underway with the bulk cash smuggling issue that I'm primarily responsible for has to do with giving the Mexicans greater capacity to detect cash that's being smuggled into Mexico. As Director Kierlikowski was mentioning a few minutes ago, the Mexicans are now inspecting southbound cargo in a way that they had never done before, and they're utilizing some of this equipment that we provided both at the land border and at air transit points and at marine points as well. These are the type of capabilities that will allow them to see into things as odd as tractor axles where monies are secreted. I think that will get to part of the problem, but I have to say that that is an integral part of the larger effort to stop money laundering through financial institutions. And that's continues to be a work in progress. We've made some progress on that, but there's much more to be done because we know that there are billions flowing in through the accounting systems that we have in our banking system and theirs, and we're only catching a sliver of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Mr. Flake.
I just had one more question. It's been said in your testimony, and also we've heard from others, that West Africa is becoming a transit point. Guinea-Bissau in particular, some of the other countries. What are we doing proactively? What structures can we put in place now, both financially and otherwise, so with DOD, to try to head this off before it becomes more of a problem? Is there something that looking back now at Latin America and South America and everything else that we could have done more easily before it became such a big problem that we can do in West Africa? And I'll go with Dr. Zubin, or Mr. Zubin first on that.
It's a real challenge that you're raising, and I think that the financial system there, the capacity of the regulatory system, the government, is really not where it needs to be in order to replicate what we've been able to do in some other places, and that's not a quick fix.
Right. Well, I get a lot of emails from Nigerians every day. So
I'd encourage you not to send money.
Good advice, thanks. On DOD side, or anybody else want to answer that, just proactively, what can we do to make it easier before it becomes more of a problem than it is?
As Adam mentioned, this is going to be probably harder than Latin America rather than easier, and that's because of the weak nature of these governments and the institutions that they have. We've jointly done some assessments of their capabilities. We've worked with the DEA to help build their partners, and this is a nascent effort. But we believe that the most effective way is going to be to invest in building institutional capacity in those governments so that they can detect, prosecute, incarcerate people, as well as build the type of linkages that we need so that they can extradite people to the United States if indeed their activities implicate criminal activity that's prosecutable under our laws.
The only thing I would add, Mr. Flake, is that through the generosity of Congress, the Drug Enforcement Administration has been able to open a second office in West Africa in 2009 in Accra, Ghana. And it was through the opening of that office and the creation of vetted teams that we're working with that we're able to, for example, this latest investigation linking AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb with drug trafficking, and our colleagues in Ghana expelled these folks, and they're sitting in a prison in New York awaiting trial. So there are things that can be done. I believe this is an order of magnitude problem. We're not resourced at a level that is commensurate with the problem that we face over there. And there's engagement with organizations like ECOWAS, the Economic Council of Western African States, and perhaps ILEA training for some of our counterparts over there. But there's much in the works, but a long, long way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I believe you're all going to take care of this, but several members on this side wanted to submit questions, and so if we could have unanimous consent to allow them for 5 days.
There's unanimous consent to allow all members to submit remarks and questions to the witnesses within the next 5 days. Do any of the witnesses have an objection to that, or would the record reflect that they're all willing to do that, and by unanimous consent, that'll be the case. Just one last set of brief questions on that. Mr. Zubin, are you properly staffed in terms of the Treasury? Does it have enough personnel in collaboration with your colleagues here and your own staff to address this at the level at which you want to address it?
We're a much smaller outfit, obviously, than some of my colleagues located here, and that's as it should be. We don't need to do the very difficult work of drug eradication.
Right. I'm assuming that you leverage them for some of the things that you need. Would that be a correct statement?
I'm sorry?
You're able to leverage their assistance for a lot of what you need?
That's very accurate. And it's DEA's field investigators, the information that they're obtaining, the information that our intelligence colleagues are obtaining, that then feeds and fuels our targeting efforts to apply sanctions.
Okay. Do you find that, like other aspects of this drug situation, that when you shut off one avenue, there's still too many avenues left available, and those would be countries that don't cooperate with the United States, and what other impediments would we have?
And I didn't hear the last few words.
Mostly the impediments that we have for getting this right are some countries still just don't cooperate, and are there other impediments as well?
I heartily agree that wherever you hit them, they then move to another area, whether that's another means of transmitting money, whether you're talking about moving from financial system to the gray market, casas de cambios, and bulk cash. There's also, as soon as we designate a company, we know that there's going to be efforts to circumvent sanctions, to create a new company, a new shell, a new front, and disguise the assets. And this is our bread and butter, is not just designating a network and walking away from it, but then monitoring very closely to see what are springing up as the attempts at evasion and hammering them again. There's a cat and mouse aspect to it, which I think is common to all law enforcement efforts, but we just have to keep at it.
I want to give each of you an opportunity. If anybody feels they wanted to contribute something but weren't giving that chance, just give me some acknowledgement here, and I'll be happy to give you an opportunity to make a closing statement on that. Mr. Karolowski?
Mr. Chairman, there was some discussion about efforts to promote legalization. The administration is on the record 100 times over that legalization of drugs is not in the President's vocabulary, it is not in mine, and it's not anything being discussed. Role models, there is only one anti-drug messaging system out there. The President requested $70 million for that, and I think that's important. And then Mr. Placido brought up the number of deaths in this country, the tragic number of deaths in this country that exceed gunshot wounds that are due to drugs. That has been spiked by prescription drugs, drugs coming right out of medicine cabinets and pharmaceutical places, not necessarily drugs flowing into the country from other countries.
Anybody else? Ambassador?
Just to follow up on a couple of points. On the issue that Mr. Flake raised with respect to West Africa, we're doing our best to get ahead of this problem. The President's request for assistance to West Africa for institution building goes up sharply in this budget from a relatively small base, but to $13.5 million. And while it is dwarfed, if you will, by some of our other programs, there's a capacity takedown from the governments involved that we have to pay attention to. Showering them with more and more resources may not be the best way. We're going to have to build and work with our partners, as Tony was mentioning, both within our government and without. The second point I'd make is, as Will was mentioning earlier, this is very much an every agency at the table operation. There's a role for AFRICOM here. There's a very big role for DEA. There's a role for institution building as well, and there's a role for controlling finance. The second point to follow up I would make, there was a question raised earlier about whether we should drop everything else we're doing and work just on Mexico. That's a very important challenge that we have, and the law of concentric circles certainly works. But we have an incredible national interest in addressing the problems of Afghanistan in order for our colleagues in the military to succeed. And so while the heroin problem from Afghanistan affects largely its immediate neighbors, in particular Iran and the Central Asian countries, as well as Europe and the Russian Federation, we have an enormous interest in helping deal with that problem, because if we don't, we're not going to succeed in any other way there at all. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add briefly to clarify the record, it's been mentioned several times that hardly any of the heroin from Afghanistan comes to the United States. And in point of fact, we run a forensic chemistry program that identifies the source geographically of the heroin that's seized in the United States, and there is a small percentage, about 4%, of the heroin seized and analyzed by our DEA laboratories has its origins in Southwest Asia, Afghanistan. But more importantly is that a large percentage of the heroin abused in Canada today comes from Southwest Asia and Afghanistan. And so it would be a mistake to simply say that this is a European problem or a problem in Iran or Russia, other places which feel the bite of Afghan heroin more strongly today, because these networks that are smuggling into Canada could very easily move that heroin into the United States and undercut the market quickly. So it's not something that we can take our eye off the ball on. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me leave this closing question with you. When we look at a range of drugs that cause problems for people, either result in deaths or addiction or health problems, also alcohol is way up there. In fact, it's way over some of the drugs that we've talked about here today. So how do we reconcile that alcohol is way up there? We spend very little attention on that. Marijuana, for instance, is way down there, and we spend an incredible amount of attention on that. Are we prioritizing any of our efforts on that, or are we taking that into account at all? Mr. Kolowski, I'll let you do that one.
Mr. Chairman, issue of underage drinking has been in all of the past national drug control strategies, a discussion about it. I think it's well recognized. It isn't exactly in my portfolio, but we're certainly able to address it and talk about it, because we also see that combination of alcohol and other types of drugs, and your points are well taken.
Sir, I would just add that our guidance from the Department of Justice and from ONDCP, for that matter, on the prioritization of these drug threats is crystal clear. And while there's been much news about law enforcement operations targeting medical marijuana, pain clinics, and the like, I can tell you that it's a minuscule part of DEA's overall effort that is spent on those kinds of operations, and that when we do get engaged in those, it is because the people engaged in that activity are violating both state and federal law, and we're doing it with the help and at the request of state governments.
So you want to tell me, Mr. Placido, that every time the federal DEA goes into a state that has legalized medical marijuana and makes a bust or an arrest in there, it gets involved in that, you've been requested to go in by the state?
We're working in conjunction with the state, that's right, sir.
You're working in conjunction with them. Have you been requested to go in by them, or is it an initiative of the federal government?
It depends on at what level you're talking about the request. I mean, there's not a formal request coming from the governor's office, but oftentimes working with local, municipal, and county authorities who've requested assistance.
Because I've read quite a bit lately, there seems to be some discontent with the fact that the policy was that, with people legalized for medical use in different states, that the federal government would basically allow that policy to be implemented, but the DEA seems to be, according to these accounts, a bit of a rogue agency off of there and just going off and doing it anyway.
I would assert that that's not the case, sir, and we'd be glad to provide you a briefing at a later time if you'd like.
I'd like that if you would. I just want to follow up on that. Mr. Karlowski?
Mr. Chairman, also the guidelines from the Attorney General's office to the United States Attorney and those attorneys in those states with medical marijuana. There is a sentence that says that they should listen to the concerns voiced by local law enforcement and prosecutors to be receptive to that issue.
Right. I understand it to be the case, but what we're reading about is that there aren't any complaints on that side, and they're going in anyway, despite local considerations otherwise. So I do want to clarify that, and I would like at least a staff briefing on that so that we can sort of clarify that issue on that. I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today, for your testimony and expertise. We'll do those follow-up questions, and I know that the members were not leaving because of disinterest, but there's a ceremony for Mr. Murtha, who passed away right now, and it's drawn a lot of members away. So thank you again. This meeting is adjourned.